Hello, geography students in the Hong Kong conflict group. The purpose of this video today is to hopefully help you kind of learn a little bit more about the Hong Kong conflict. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it, but some may not have. So hopefully this is either going to give you some firsthand kind of knowledge about it, and you can expand on it from there. So let's go ahead and get started. Most importantly, we're going to talk about some of the events that led up to Hong Kong and what we see as being the major issues there today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the historical background and a little bit about its geography. So first of all, Hong Kong is located in China. It's this little pin right here. It is right next to Taiwan, which is also influenced by China. In the past, China was a very big empire that ruled over a bunch of different places. So this is still kind of a callback to that sort of time period. So getting into the history of Hong Kong a little bit. In the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, China and Britain went to war. And this was called the Opium Wars, which has a ton of different political ties. Yes, it was a war about Britain exporting drugs to China. We're not going to get super into detail about that because you don't really need to know everything about it. The main piece that you do need to understand is that Britain ended up winning that war in the mid-1800s and won Hong Kong. So even though Hong Kong is technically inside of China, Britain still got to rule over it. And while Britain ruled over Hong Kong, it became a major business center. They built it up. As Britain is a capitalist and democratic place, similar to the United States, they allowed Hong Kong to be democratic, to have free elections, to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and a lot of those things that we take for granted sometimes here because we're just so used to them, and those are our basic rights. And in China, that wasn't necessarily the case. China during this time period was communist. So remember what we learned about communism. The government really gets involved with the economy. They tell you what job you can have. They tell you what kind of education you can have. They're basically controlling how much money everyone makes, and they get to make all the decisions. The exact opposite of capitalism, where we really get choice in what we're doing. So in Hong Kong at this time, they're very used to being a democratic kind of capitalist center for Britain, and they get a lot more democracy than communist China would have given them, because generally when we think about political systems and government systems, we see communist places as more of dictatorships, which we learned about earlier in the semester. In 1997, however, Britain ends up giving Hong Kong back to China. They have this big compromise, and they do end up agreeing that Hong Kong will be allowed to run its own economy, its own justice system, and its police force. This was to try to make the transition a little bit of a softer blow and a little bit easier for Hong Kong to handle, just because remember, Hong Kong's been very used to being ruled by Britain, very used to having these certain economic and personal freedoms. And coming under China's rule, they're not necessarily going to have that as much. So Hong Kong's sort of in this weird limbo state at this point where they're kind of independent, but kind of not, because they kind of get a say in their own economy, they get a say in their own justice system, they have their own police force, but China is still controlling Hong Kong's military. It's still telling them who they can and can't trade with, who they can and can't talk to, kind of their foreign affairs, and it's controlling some of their political system. For example, Hong Kong has to approve, or China has to approve Hong Kong's leaders, so they can't even really elect their own leader without Hong Kong getting involved. As you can imagine, this is of course going to cause some tension. The people of Hong Kong, like I said before, are used to freedoms and democracy that now they don't have. Now they're much more restricted underneath Chinese influence. There are some people living in Hong Kong who are definitely a little bit more pro-China. They're okay with China influencing them, with China having some say, because China is a huge, huge global economy. And there are a lot of opportunities for people in Hong Kong to go work in China, to make money in China, to trade with China, to make money in that way, right? So it definitely helps some people living in Hong Kong. But the problem is there are others who just want their rights back. And some who even want complete independence from China. They just want to be their own nation entirely. Being geographically located within China, though, makes it a little bit hard for them to really break free, right? Because they're actually inside of China's borders. Because of this, there are protests over the years, And they're not massive, but they are sizable. And some people really want to have more rights. And that's basically what the initial protests are going to be about. And they do happen over the years, all the way from 1997 to now, but we're going to see that something changes. So, the current conflict, the thing that you guys are going to be focusing on in your actual presentation and your research, are protests. The difference is these protests are massive, and they are a lot more involved than any protests that Hong Kong and China have ever seen before. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened. The current protests. So last year, in February, there's this thing called an extradition bill. Extradition is a fancy word that basically means if you're a criminal and you have committed a crime somewhere, but then you try to flee and go back to your own country, the other country can take you and still prosecute you under their law, because technically you broke a law in their country. And your own country that you're trying to hide in has to give you up to them. So that's basically what extradition means. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but essentially there's a murder case. And somebody from Hong Kong murders someone in Taiwan. He goes back to Hong Kong, and Taiwan obviously wants to prosecute him because he murdered someone in their country. Right? So Hong Kong, the government, tries to work with Taiwan. They try to say, we're going to have this extradition bill in February, and it's going to allow us to send our suspected criminals to the countries where they committed crimes in. So we'll be able to send our citizen who murdered someone in Taiwan back to Taiwan, and then he can get prosecuted. So it's a little bit confusing, but that's basically where this starts. The problem is, China's involved in this. And a lot of people, especially those who think that China is abusing their power, because China does kind of have a history of being a little bit repressive, of not allowing free elections, of corruption, of silencing people, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of people in Hong Kong are worried that China will just start to say, oh, well, somebody in Hong Kong committed a crime here, even when they necessarily didn't, just so China can arrest political opponents and people who speak out against their government and people who want more rights from their government. So again, people start to worry in Hong Kong that China is going to say they're committing crimes, even when they're not, even when they're just practicing free speech and speaking out against what they think is unfair about China, and then China will arrest them and put them in prisons and things like that. Once the word of this kind of spreads, massive pro-democracy protests start. They have about 2 million people, which is a pretty massive protest. They are all in the city centers, and they last longer than ever before, right? This started in 2019, and it's still happening today, and there's not really an end in sight yet. So there are more people involved, and there's more violence. The police have started to respond with guns, with tear gas, all of that kind of stuff. Even though this protest started out peacefully, like a lot do, it ended up ramping up, getting into the riot point at some points in the protest because some people get pretty crazy about it. There's been lots of vandalism, lots of buildings destroyed, parts of cities are destroyed, and again, it's kind of the police versus the citizens here. So today's main issues. You are looking at the massive protests, right? Even though the extradition bill was stopped, the government said, okay, we're not going to go forward with the extradition bill. You got what you wanted. It was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, in that the people didn't even care about the extradition bill anymore. Now that they're protesting, they're going to keep protesting until they get their freedom and until they get their rights. So these freedom fighters essentially don't even care that the extradition bill is out the window, which is what initially sparked their anger. They're still going to keep protesting until they get what they want, which in most cases is more voting rights, more freedom of speech, more freedoms in general. They also want investigation into police brutality against citizens. Some who are a little bit more radical want full independence, though. They want to break away from China entirely. So this is essentially what you're looking into. You're going to look into maybe the political leaders here, some of the leaders of the protests, You're going to look into what's happening currently with the protests, if there's been any kind of way to try to stop them, or if the government is abusing its power, anything like that. That's what you guys are going to keep researching as you go forward. But this is basically, in a nutshell, what's happening today and kind of what led us to this point in history. So, additional information for you. All of these links right here, there's some really good videos, some really good articles. Those are all going to help you. So make sure that you use those and go ahead and start answering those questions once you feel prepared. Good luck.